So we're going to begin with this guy, okay? This is a test. We're in an academic environment, so this is a test. Who knows who this happy fellow is? Way to go, Jonathan Edwards. Exactly, okay? That is Jonathan Edwards. He was Princeton's third president, okay, 1703 to 1758. He was one of the really leading lights in religious philosophy of his time. He was one of the really driving forces in the First Great Awakening, which was sort of 1730 to late 40s. Just an amazing guy. At Stanford, I was an undergraduate, we had a history of Western civilization course, which was mandatory. And I read this sermon that he wrote 50 years ago, roughly 50 years ago. And I still remember it. And I don't know if any of you have read it. It's called Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. Okay? And I'm going to try to read it. I'm a mild-mannered engineering professor, so I'm going to try to read it as I think Jonathan Edwards might have preached it from wherever he preached it from. So here we go. Okay. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of pure eyes and to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times more abominable in his eyes than the most hateful venomous serpent is in ours. O sinner, consider the fearful danger you are in. It is a great furnace of wrath, a wide and bottomless pit full of the fire of wrath that you are held over in the hand of that God, whose wrath is provoked and incensed as much against you as against many of the damned in hell. For you hang by a slender thread, with the flames of divine wrath flashing about you, and ready every moment to singe it and burn it asunder. It is everlasting wrath. It would be dreadful to suffer this fierceness and wrath of Almighty God one moment, but you must suffer it all eternity. There will be no end to this exquisite, horrible misery. So we read that in the History of Western Civilization course. It certainly doesn't leave a really great impression of the early Christian Puritan thinkers to have read that, of course. That wasn't the purpose of our history teacher, to try to make us feel warm and friendly about Christian faith. So clearly Jonathan Edwards has some pretty strong ideas about sin and its consequences. So should we be preaching this message, his Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, should we be doing this over in Frisk? Should we all wander over there and take turns preaching this sermon over at the campus center? Is it because we're afraid? Well, we shouldn't be. Is it because we'd be embarrassed? Well, it shouldn't be. Those aren't good enough excuses. I don't think we should, because our culture is not in the same place that Jonathan Edwards was speaking to. And it's because our culture has completely lost the sense of sin. Sin as a category, I think, is just not in our society and our culture. Now, if you were to go out and try to come up with a consensus for what is sinful, you may, after a lot of talking, decide that clubbing harp seal cubs is a sin, or that having too large a carbon footprint is a sin. But it's going to be hard to go from there and get much of a consensus on what sin means in our culture today. But has the problem of sin gone away? No, it's still the issue that separates us from God. And we're designed to be in relationship with that God, which we have been told we're separated by sin. It's still the reason that Jesus was here. It's still the reason for the gospel. It's still the reason that we've been called to bring people back into relationship with God, to be part of that process, that healing process in our society and in our world. But we need to think about what sin is and how to communicate it to our culture. And that's the first thing I want to try to think about. I think the person who's done the best thinking about this is a pastor, Tim Keller, who is a pastor of a group of churches in New York City. And Tim has a book called A Reason for God. And he has this quote in the book: sin is not just the doing of bad things, but the making of good things into ultimate things. It's seeking to establish a sense of self by making something else more central to your significance, purpose, and happiness than your relationship with God. So here's the key point in that. Making good things into ultimate things. Okay? Now, why is that so important and so significant here at Princeton? And that's because you are all incredibly competitive and incredibly good at what you do. Let's look at Genesis 1 and talk about how God made us. So it's Genesis 1:26, and God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion." And it goes on, dominion over all the birds and creatures and seas and earth. So God has built into us, the way we are constructed is to have dominion. That is, we are to exercise control, success, to be competitive. Okay? That's just how God has made us. And you are especially good at being successful and competitive. You beat out, is it 13 or 15 or 17 other students who didn't get into Princeton and you did. Okay? So this dominion is something built into us, and it's something especially significant here at Princeton because it's just that strength that you have which is the fulcrum for a weakness. And that fulcrum is to believe that you have the ability to control, that is, you can have dominion over merely good things and put them in the place of ultimate things. Okay, and that's the essence of sin, is replacing what should be ultimate things, our relationship with God, with merely good things. And it's especially, as I said, significant for us here at Princeton because all of you are so very good and are very close to feeling you have the power to make those good things the center of your life, to make them define you and what is good and what is right and what has meaning in your life. Okay, so, however, what Tim Keller is saying in that if we put these only merely good things as the basis for meaning in our life, where do we fall short? What are the problems with that? We actually sang songs about this tonight. And you go back to St. Augustine and this very famous quote, "Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee." So the problem with substituting merely good things for the ultimate things, for God himself in our lives, is that those merely good things will never satisfy. Will success satisfy you? No. There'll always be people more successful or people who block your route to success and cause frustration. There'll always be something where success will never be ultimately satisfying. Will material things be ultimately satisfying? No, they won't. That's easy to argue. Well, what about I'm going to be the most loving boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse, and by being so loving, that's going to give me meaning. I'll know I'm a good person because I'm going to be so loving. Is that a basis for meaning in life? And no, it's not. That's a horrible, horrible pressure to put on a relationship to make that other person respond to your love and to affirm that you are loving them enough. Or for you to feel failure that you aren't loving them in the way that you know you ought to. So those are both tensions for frustration and for those even doing something good, loving, which we all should love, but to make that the basis for your life is a recipe for frustration and futility. Same thing about doing good things, working in the inner city. I'm going to give you some examples from students in a minute. But they do good things. Isn't that the basis? Can I define myself? Can I say I am a good person, I am worthwhile, I have meaning, because I'm going to give my life to working in the inner city? No, because if that's the basis of your meaning, those people you are ministering to are not going to appreciate you enough. It's going to cause frustration. It's why there's such tremendous burnout people in the social welfare fields. Okay? Or you're going to say, I just can't do this. This is too frustrating for me, and you'll fail on your own terms. So putting anything that is merely good in the place of what should be the ultimate is what sin is all about. And a message that we have that there is something that should be put there, which is in fact ultimate, which is God himself. So how do we know that, what does it mean to live a life that's a successful life? A life that really does put God in the center and that gives us meaning and significance. And for that, I want to go to three students. So this is Jeff Bass on the left. The main photo's from 1979. Jeff and Alan Green on the right were students here, along with Joseph Cumming on the bottom. That's not his picture of 1979. That's a more contemporary picture. He didn't have an old one. And I've gotten these were very special friends of mine. They helped me put a roof on a house. So we had a really special relationship with them. They graduated in 1983. And I want to share with you their lives and talk about what success means and how God leads us. So let's start with Alan Green over on the left. So, whoops, I have too many E's in his name there. Sorry about that. Who's Alan? Alan was the most effective evangelist I've ever met, period. He led tremendous numbers of his classmates to Christ. He was put in charge of the evangelism program of, at that point there were two major Christian groups on campus, PF and Alpha and Omega. Actually, all three of those students spent time in both fellowships. But he was put in charge of PEF's evangelism outreach as a sophomore. Just an amazingly gifted guy. Along end of his junior year, he was spending all of his time in ministry. Jeff and Joseph and another friend took him aside and said, Alan, you are too important for the kingdom to waste your time here at Princeton and not to succeed, which is a strange sort of thing to say. But what they were saying is, Alan, there are plans, God has plans for you that are bigger and further down the road. And if you don't succeed academically, or if you shirk off academically, you're going to compromise those bigger plans for you. Alan dropped out of leading all of the Bible studies he was leading. He focused on his academics. He did spectacularly well. He went to University of San Francisco Medical School, which is one of the top medical schools, and set up a medical practice. And has founded a number of companies. This drgreen.com, Let's Talk About Kids' Health, is cited by the AMA as, get the quote here, the AMA has called this the pioneering physician website. So what Alan has done is to say, let's take information technology and get medical service and care out to a broader spectrum of people at a lower cost. And he's done this with a series of these Dr. Green websites, websites for mothers, websites for healthcare for children, which is his main focus, and has made a dramatic impact on medical healthcare in the California area. He's been on TED Talks, if you're familiar with those. So he's had an amazing impact based on his ability to go to medical school, have his medical career. His wife had terminal cancer in 1996, and she was miraculously cured. Now, this is coming from a physician saying this, not your sort of local person who doesn't know anything. At that point, they decided that everything they were going to do was going to be free. All the medical advice, they want to get medical advice out to people for free. So all the services, all these web-based counseling and advice things are free. So that's the first person, that's Al Green. Now let's go to Jeff Bass. So Jeff, so I had a chance to talk with all three of these because they're at the point where their kids were thinking about colleges. So they've come here with their kids thinking about Princeton as a place to go. So that's been fun to talk with him. And the discussion with Jeff, he said he's married to Ellen. Ellen and Jeff met the first day on campus as freshmen. And then Jeff would say, I dated Ellen for 4 years and she dated me for 3 years. He said it took her a year to realize that I was the guy she ought to be dating. So Jeff was a civil engineer by training, and I think you see that. This website, if you look at the bottom, it says Principles Venn diagram. Okay, who else but an engineer would put there at the bottom a Venn diagram to describe the principles of their ministry outreach? So Jeff felt God called him to hold to a Sabbath. So on Sunday he said, I will go to church, I'm going to do no work, no study, I just need that to be a day that I devote to God. He made the comment he thinks it hurt him academically. He could have done better. But the question is, we'll see, what was success, okay? He graduated, he got a job with A.D. Little, which is one of the top consulting companies in Boston. If you go on their site, he's still listed as the 11th most influential person in hazardous waste management. He was there a number of years, and then Jeff decided that consulting was damaging his family. The traveling he was doing was damaging to their family relationship. And so he stepped down from A.D. Little, made that commitment based on his priorities. He then, in Boston, trying to decide what to do, he began volunteering and then worked on a staff of a large interracial church in inner city Boston, a Ruggles church. And after a few years, this opportunity opened for Emmanuel Gospel Center. So this is a interdenominational, interracial center in Boston dedicated to serving the poor and building communities in churches and in the community at large to strengthen the inner city. And if you go on the site, you'll see just the amazing things that they've been doing. Jeff said his commitment is at 5 o'clock he leaves every day to come home to be with his wife and kids. Kids are now gone, but when they were younger. Because he said, I'm not a hero, and the organization, God will provide what needs to happen for us to work. And this is my commitment. And God has led him into this position of being able to really be a Christian voice. And the Emmanuel Gospel Center, a strong Christian voice in building interracial bonds and strengthening churches among the poor in Boston. That's Jeff. Now let's go to Joseph Cumming. Joseph, whose daughter did go here, and several years ago I met her here at this Prince of Faith in Action. Okay? Joseph decided that he was called to go to the poorest, least Christian nation that they could find. So a group of 5 of them, upon graduation, went to Mauritania, which is in Western Africa on the coast. And they went there because it was the least Christianized nation in the world. There were 5 of them, a community that went, and what they said is, we are going to live at the same level as the people we serve, okay? And we're going to serve. So they lived for the first 5 years in a 10-foot by 12-foot cinder block room. The room next door was another Muslim family. They shared a latrine. They had no electricity. They had no running water. And they ministered. During the ministry that he's had there in Doulos Fellowship, they have provided medical assistance and food for over 30,000 people. They've cut the infant malnutrition rate from 70% to 20%. They have these amazing network of centers and governmental, non-governmental organization outposts serving those in Mauritania. It's a Muslim country, and so he asked me not to talk about what they do in terms of evangelism, but they've had an amazing impact on evangelizing the Muslims in Mauritania, because what? Just like Jesus, what did he do? He came down from heaven, became one of us, and lived at our level. And that's what Joseph and that community decided they were going to do. And it's why they've had such an amazing impact. Well, as Joseph and the community got more and more known, there would be imams coming and asking them what was Christianity about, and would they come and speak to their mosques about the Christian faith. And so this happened more and more often. Joseph decided he needed some more training in this area, and so he went back to the States and first got a seminary degree and then a PhD from Yale in Arabic and Near Eastern Studies. He still leads the Doulos Fellowship. He now also pastors a church, Yale International Church at Yale. But he's been a key person in establishing the dialogue. There's a whole center at Yale that he helped establish, dialogue between Christians and Muslims. And so here is, again, a guy with an incredible impact by taking steps that were to leave here a wealthy first world person and live at the level of someone in Mauritania. So, what are the elements of a successful and fulfilling life? I'll give you a little bit of my story too. This will be an abbreviated version. I was in high school. My mom became a Christian. Therefore, she tried to cajole me, coerce me, just badger me. It's totally obnoxious and bothersome. But I gave in eventually and went to one meeting, and that was a Young Life meeting in our high school, my junior year. And all the people who were sitting there, I knew them, of course, and they were all hypocrites. They were the crowd that would go to the lake and drink. I had no respect at all for any of those people. But the guy who spoke that night was Randy Linder. I still know his name. He had graduated the year before, was a basketball player. He was not the sharpest tack in the box at all. But I knew Randy, and I knew the integrity in his life, and he spoke about following and knowing Jesus Christ. I never went back to Young Life, but I went back and started reading my Bible. And after about 3 or 4 months of just reading the New Testament, I was convinced that Jesus Christ was who he said he was, the Son of God who had come to seek and to save, and that I should follow him because he was in fact Lord. I got down on my knees and I prayed, and I became a Christian late in my junior year in high school. Not much happened in my senior year. I grew a little bit, I'm sure. I went off to Stanford. It happens some, Went off to Stanford. Didn't want to come east. I could have gone to MIT, but there were a bunch of just, nerds up there. And so I decided to stay out west and go to Stanford. And there I met really a group of Christians that was formative in my life. Both graduate students, undergraduates. I dove into reading, so read everything C.S. Lewis did, G.K. Chesterton. They were just great books that you really should read, informative books in your Christian life. At the end of my freshman year, I was awarded one of the Outstanding Freshman Awards at the university. And that, a very secular event, was a trigger in my life to say, just like what I'm talking about before, that I don't need to base my success or my self-worth on my academics. And God used that as a trigger in my life to not worry about my academics. I got very involved in ministries. I led Bible studies. I ran one of the freshman dorms, ran all the freshman Bible studies, started a Christian newspaper on campus, was involved in ministering to the director of admissions, who was a really fine man who was struggling with sexual issues. And it was a wonderful time. My grades were not anything like they were at the beginning, but I knew at that point that I was being obedient to what God was calling me to do. I'll fast forward through several years and get to grad school. And I got into the grad schools I wanted to get into, and was married. We had a child in grad school, and I went to interview at positions and was offered positions, decided to come to Princeton. I didn't think there was any way I'd get an offer at Princeton because I already had 3 people in my field. So I didn't think there was any way that another position, they would offer me a position when they already had 3 people who were doing very good work in this field. But I think God opened that door. God wanted me here, and therefore made that available. I came here, and much like Jeff Bass, I felt God really wanted me to honor my family, and I never brought work home on the weekends. So all my other colleagues were working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, and I put a constraint on myself to say my family is where God wants me on that period of time. Now, I would come in one night a week, usually Tuesday, work till 3 or 4 in the morning. I was younger then, I could do that easily, and got a whole lot done when everyone else is gone. But that weekend time was a time not to be at work. So 3 of us came up for tenure. I got tenure. The others did not. That was God, I'm sure, wanting me to be here. Once again, if I hadn't got tenure, I would have been absolutely fine because I believed I was being obedient to what God was asking me to do in my priorities. So in Alan, Jeff, Joseph, or in my life, I think one of the lessons is that we only see God's intervention and leading in retrospect. If you look at the decisions that Jeff made, okay, I'm going to honor God and obey a Sabbath because I feel he wants me to do that. That leads to a job in 80 Little. That leads to another decision. That leads to going to Ruggles Community Church. That leads to being the director of this Emmanuel Fellowship Center. You can't see the future. You don't know where God is going to take you. But what you do know is the immediate obedience he's asking you, the choices he's asking you to make. And that's all you can do, is to be obedient to those choices. I think here are the main take-home points I'd like you to think about and take home from this talk. The first is obedience has roots. And what do I mean by that? I mean that decisions you make now are putting roots in the ground that will bear fruit 20, 30, 40 years from now. Your decisions about your priorities, your decisions about reading scripture, your decisions about are you going to fellowship with believers, are you going to grow? These decisions you make are the roots that will have their fruit much later in your life. So obedience has roots. Don't wait to say later it's going to be okay and I can make these decisions or God is asking me to make. Make them now. Priorities have consequences. Again, the decisions you make, the priorities you hold, will have consequences in your life. Set those priorities and act accordingly. Because, down at number 4, you have to live as if God is in control of your future. And he is, of course, we know that, but live that way. That is, make decisions based on the priorities he thinks he's asking you to abide by, and then trust in him for the outcome. Okay? The decisions I made in ministering my last 3 years at Stanford, I believe, were in obedience to what God has asked me to do. And God opened up, I was at Harvard, at Wisconsin, coming here to Princeton in ways that probably shouldn't have happened on any sort of human level. But being obedient, I believe God got me where he wanted me to be today. Community makes a difference. And so I gave the example of Joseph and his community of 5 people going to Mauritania. That is, we need our brothers and sisters. God never intended you to lead the Christian life on your own. Community makes all the difference in the world. And dare and dream bold things. And I was talking, this is Joseph Cumming, he said, be sure to tell them when you talk to them that don't just go with the next step. Don't just take the easy route. Don't just go to career services when they come down from Price Waterhouse or wherever and wine and dine everybody and say, do you want to take this job? Dare and dream bold things for the kingdom of God. And God will take care of the consequences. God will you can trust in him to work out his will in your life. So what's our legacy? I'm at one end. I'm not at the end of my life, thankfully. But I'm certainly further in that end of the spectrum than you are, okay? And so I think more of legacy than you do, and that's fair enough. But think a little bit about what your legacy is going to be. So clearly, legacy is not things. Okay, you get a building named after you. Big deal, that's a thing. You might say, well, my kids are going to be my legacy. It's very popular among professors to say, oh, it's my students who are my legacy. They are the next generation. Blah, blah, blah. Those really aren't our legacy. Our legacy is really described here in Acts 13, where it talks about the end of the life of David. And it said, David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation. And I really challenge you, that's the legacy. The legacy is we are part of, you are part of God's purpose. Okay? Right now, you are part of God's purpose for the Princeton campus. God has called you here tonight to give you something to do for his kingdom. And our legacy is being a faithful part of that purpose after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation. And that's really our legacy. Okay? I want to end, I've appreciated being able to share these thoughts with you. We began with Jonathan Edwards. And I'm sure you're all sort of grimacing about Jonathan Edwards, but I want to end with the Jonathan Edwards quote, which I think may give us a little warmer feeling about him. So here are his 2 resolutions. Resolution 1, I will live for God. Resolution 2, if no one else does, I still will. And that should be really the resolution in our lives, is that God has been faithful to us and asks us, in fact, to respond to that He is the ultimate meaning. Okay? He has given you gifts to be in dominion, okay, to use. And the three, Jeff and Alan and Joseph, I gave you, they're really gifted people, and they are really using those gifts to bring creation into dominion. Okay? And you can rightfully do that in relationship to God. And so I will live for God, and if no one else does, I still will. So thanks for your time.